Fear is a natural emotion and a survival mechanism. When we face a perceived threat, our bodies react in specific ways. The physical responses to fear include sweating, an increased heart rate, and elevated adrenaline levels that make us extremely alert. This physical reaction is also known as the fight or flight response, where your body prepares itself either to engage in combat or to flee. This biochemical reaction may have evolved as a crucial survival mechanism. It is an automatic response essential to our survival. Fear is highly personalized through emotional responses. This is because fear involves some of the same chemical reactions in our brains as positive emotions like happiness and excitement. In certain situations, the sensation of fear can even be enjoyable, such as when watching horror movies. Some people, often adrenaline seekers, thrive on fear-inducing activities like extreme sports or thrilling experiences. Others, however, react negatively to fear and go to great lengths to avoid scary situations at all costs. And have you ever wondered where instinctive fear originates? Many animals in nature instinctively fear and intentionally avoid things they have never seen before. Humans are the same. From childhood, we tend to fear insects, but only the truly venomous ones: scorpions, centipedes, and spiders, while harmless insects like crickets or grasshoppers rarely cause fear. No one teaches us which creatures to fear, yet somehow, we already know. And then, in an unusual way, I found a satisfying answer to this mystery. It happened about 30 years ago when I was a teacher assigned to a poverty-stricken and deeply traditional country. My mission was to educate the locals about culture, science, and subjects like geography and history, helping them integrate into the world. I was a messenger, bringing knowledge of the outside world to them. The first 3 months were pure torture for me. Beyond the language barrier, the scorching 40-degree heat of this land left me constantly exhausted. But every time I saw the innocent eyes of the children or the hardworking farmers light up with curiosity when they listened to my stories about the world beyond their borders, I felt an invisible force pushing me forward, compelling me to continue. I, along with a few other team members, stayed at the school where I was teaching. Unlike the surrounding houses made of clay and thatched roofs, this school was not as grand as one might imagine a proper institution to be, but it was sufficient. It consisted of 2 buildings arranged in an L shape, built with bricks and cement materials that were ordinary elsewhere but considered a luxury in this region. The roof was tiled, though there were occasional leaks, which I and others frequently repaired, ensuring that any damage was fixed within a day or two. This L-shaped building had 2 floors, making it the tallest structure in this impoverished countryside. Sometimes, when repairing the roof, I would find myself gazing at the endless fields stretching toward the horizon. It was a surreal beauty, one that I doubted I would ever witness again. Perhaps, without realizing it, I had started to develop feelings for and fall in love with this land. The government had given me multiple opportunities to return home. Transferring my responsibilities to someone else due to political shifts this country was no longer a priority for foreign aid. But time and again, I refused to leave, even as my colleagues had long since returned. At the time, I believed I was staying out of love for this small but beautiful village. Looking back now, I think I simply wanted to live as a hero in that place. The villagers admired me, and I enjoyed that feeling. I dread returning to my homeland, where I was just a lowly bookworm, insignificant in society. Choosing to return would have been the wiser choice, rather than clinging to my inflated sense of self-importance. After all my colleagues had left, I hired a local woman as an interpreter and assistant to help me communicate. Her name was Qabihoy, the ugliest woman in the village. But don't let my words mislead you, she was not truly ugly. Her hair curled in soft waves. Her amber-brown eyes gleamed. Her oval face was framed by naturally perfect eyebrows, and her sunk-eyed skin was strikingly beautiful. She stood at 1.65 meters, an unimaginable height for women in that region, and her figure was reminiscent of Renaissance statues, flawless in every way. Yet, precisely because of these traits, she was labeled the ugliest woman in the village. It was absurd beauty standards that were vastly different from ours. A beautiful woman in their eyes had to have pitch black skin, so dark that even a flashlight wouldn't cause any reflection. Her breasts had to sag past her navel, and she couldn't be taller than 1.5 meters. By their standards, they weren't chunky. Qabihoy truly was ugly. My work progressed smoothly even after I was left alone, as did my personal life. It didn't take long for Qabihoy and me to fall for each other, and after 6 months of working together, we decided to marry in the village. It was my way of declaring that I would stay here, in this small but vibrant and beautiful village. Our wedding followed local customs. It wasn't much different from Christian ceremonies in other countries, except that their deity was not Jesus, and their marriage vows were somewhat peculiar. Instead of for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Their vow was, until death is the final point for both of us. At first, I assumed both phrases carried the same meaning, but a month after our wedding, I realized what it truly meant. Unfortunately, that month marked the outbreak of a viral fever pandemic sweeping across the world. Although this country was rarely affected by global events, its poor healthcare system made it vulnerable to the disease's spread. Patients weren't properly isolated, and the government's weak management allowed the virus to reach our small village. Kun, a simple farmer who never missed any of my lessons, succumbed to the disease. But what happened next changed my life forever. I remember that day. It was pouring rain. I saw his wife cradling his lifeless body, wailing in anguish. At first, I thought her grief was normal. Anyone would mourn the loss of a loved one. But then I realized she wasn't mourning for her husband, she was mourning for herself. Qabihoy explained to me the village's long-standing tradition. The phrase "until death is the final point" for both of us meant that when one spouse died, the other would be buried alive with them. A chill ran down my spine. How the hell does this barbaric custom still exist today? I thought. I took Qabihoy home, trying to push the disturbing reality from my mind. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, the villagers' loud voices woke me. I stepped outside and saw them holding torches, their faces smeared with something that looked like fresh blood. They carried spears, machetes, and crude weapons. They no longer resembled the simple farmers I knew. They looked like a cult, like something out of those white-robed fanatics I had heard about on the radio. They marched in a long procession, and at the end of the line, I saw Kun's wife. Her head, hands, and legs had been severed, and her remains were impaled on a wooden cross. My stomach churned at the sight, and I collapsed, vomiting into the grass. That was the fate of those who tried to escape this horrific tradition. Kun's wife had been caught and executed while attempting to flee on a raft. From that day on, every time my wife showed signs of illness, an unnatural fear gripped me. I feared for Qabihoy, but I also feared for myself. And then, I learned something even more chilling. That night, as I lay in bed, Qabihoy confessed that she was the one who had reported Kun's wife's escape attempt to the villagers. She had betrayed her. At that moment, all my love for my wife twisted into something irrecognizable. I could no longer see my future in this village. I desperately wanted to return home. But war, the pandemic, and closed borders made leaving impossible. I could only hope to survive until the international airport, or at least the border, reopened. Speaking of my wife, on the night when Kun's wife was captured and brutally executed, I woke up to find that she was not by my side. Later, I discovered the truth. Qabihoy was the one who had reported Kun's wife to the villagers. One night, Qabihoy confessed to me that Kun's wife had confided in her about her escape plan. Clearly, she had chosen the wrong person to trust. And perhaps, I had chosen the wrong person to be my life partner. At that moment, every good impression I had of my wife became distorted, and my desire to return to my homeland grew stronger than ever. I couldn't blame Qabihoy. She was a devout believer, and this was her faith, something we have no right to judge. But still, all my thoughts of peacefully spending the rest of my life in this place had come to an end. However, as if it were a cruel joke of fate, Qabihoy had also succumbed to the deadly plague. For a week, I desperately tried to cure my wife, using every bit of my medical knowledge, purchasing all the medicine I could in the hope that she would recover. A neighbor, Shar, once he learned that Qabihoy was infected, visited our house every day. Without my permission, he would always climb over the wall and sneak into our home. Then, the moment I feared the most finally arrived, Qabihoy took her last labored breath on our bed at midnight after battling the illness for over a week. Before she passed, she grasped my hand with her frail, bone-thin fingers and whispered, "Until death is our final destination." Since when had the blessing for a couple become a curse? A death sentence for me as well? I refused to accept this reality. At first, I thought about keeping this a secret for a few days to figure out the best course of action. But as I turned toward the door, I saw Night peeking through the small window under the dim moonlight. Startled, I rushed to open the door, only to see Shar jumping down from the second floor, scaling the wall, and sprinting toward the village center. I knew then that I couldn't hide this. If I tried, there was no telling what they would do to me. The next morning, I informed the villagers of my wife's death and gradually came to terms with the fact that she wouldn't have to wait long before I joined her on the path to death. The village elder performed all the necessary rituals, and then Shar, along with several strong men from the village, brought a coffin to my doorstep. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. A coffin with 2 spaces. I knew exactly what would happen if I refused to die alongside my wife. So even though I didn't want to, I had to comply, and I wasn't going to accept it so easily. I packed a small bag containing a torch, a lighter, some dried food, and a machete I often used for clearing weeds. I carefully arranged everything, placing my teaching books on top, telling them that I wanted to take knowledge with me to the afterlife. They easily agreed. Once everything was ready, I lay down neatly inside the coffin beside my wife's cold corpse. The scent of lemongrass, musk, and wildflowers mingled together, forming an aroma that still haunts me to this day. They sealed the lid, and darkness swallowed me whole. I felt myself being lifted, the sensation rising and falling with each step of the pallbearers. At that moment, I recalled the stories Qabihoy had told me that the dead would be placed inside coffins and thrown into a vast, unknown well, where something below would take care of the rest. But when I asked her where the well was, she had only responded with silence. For about an hour, the coffin was carried through the village. Occasionally, I felt myself being low momentarily before being lifted again, likely as they switched carriers due to the weight. Finally, we came to a stop, and I could hear the distance, haunting sound of gongs and cymbals. I knew this was the end of my journey. My fear reached its peak. I was certain that this was where I would die. As the gongs fell silent, my body was thrown into chaos within the confined space. Qabihoy's corpse collapsed onto me, and I quickly pushed it away, pinning it with my legs so it wouldn't fall over again. That's when I realized the coffin was in free fall. I grabbed the cushion inside the coffin and wrapped it around myself while keeping Qabihoy's body secured in place with my leg. The fall lasted only about 10 seconds before I hit the bottom. The impact was violent. Once again, Qabihoy's body toppled onto me, and I hurriedly pushed hard to the other side. A nauseating sensation welled up inside me similar to the feeling of being in a rapidly descending elevator. Then, the coffin jolted violently once more. I realized that we had been dropped into a water-filled well when I felt dampness seeping into my feet. I fumbled inside my bag for the machete, intending to pry open the lid, but a gut instinct warned me against it. The coffin was too narrow for me to determine if the lid was floating on the water's surface or if the entire coffin had flipped upside down. The sensation of drifting suggested we were floating, but there was a terrifying possibility that the coffin had overturned. I struck my lighter to check. The flame flared up, searing one side of my face. No doubt the coffin was upside down. I quickly shifted my weight to Qabihoy's side, making the coffin tilt. Then, with a forceful roll, I flipped it back upright. I tested the lighter again. The flame pointed upward. With my machete, I pried at the nails securing the lid, but as I reached into my bag for the blade, I felt something cold grip my arm. I froze. I turned the lighter's glow toward Qabihoy's face. Her eyes were open. A jolt of terror shot through me. I shoved her body aside and swiftly resumed my task of opening the coffin. With calculated movements, I loosened the nails at the head, along the sides, and then pressed hard to break the remaining seals. The first thing I felt upon opening the coffin was an overwhelming coldness. Inside the coffin, my body heat had protected me from the bone-chilling air outside. I retrieved my torch, removed the plastic wrap to prevent the kerosene from evaporating, and lit it. The flames barely bright and the surroundings. Everything remained swallowed by inky darkness. What I saw resembled an underground river, much like the descriptions of a massive cave recently discovered, one with a river and prehistoric flora. Then I heard a sound in the distance. The roar of a waterfall. Shit. Panic gripped me as I realized I was being carried toward it. I tried to leap from the coffin, but it was too late. The coffin plunged over the edge. Thankfully, it wasn't a very high drop but enough to break my leg upon impact. I screamed in agony, my voice echoing eerily in the cavern. Nearby, my torch was still burning. My machete was beside me. I reached for it and began crawling toward the light. After a few steps, I heard something, a noise, followed by a pale figure darting past my right side. I muttered, "What the hell was that?" Fear surged through me, and I crawled faster, gasping for breath. I clawed at the ground with my machete, desperate to move quicker. Finally, I reached the torch. Immediately, I spun around, holding the flame toward the darkness to see what was there. What I saw still sent shivers down my spine. It stood in front of me. I wasn't sure if it was human, but it had arms and legs. Its skin was deathly pale, devoid of hair. Its teeth were tiny, like those of a child who had lost most of them. Its eyes cloudy and completely white. What made me think it had once been human was the traditional village clothing it wore. As I raised the torch, it recoiled, screeching, and in the flickering light, I saw more of them, 3, maybe for moving toward Qabihoy. One of them was holding her hand and biting into it. Adrenaline overrode the pain in my broken leg. I scrambled to my feet, hopping forward. Every 2 steps, I turned the torch behind me. Every 2 steps, their numbers grew. They chanted in a language I didn't understand. I screamed and backed away, holding the torch in defense. My senses were overwhelmed by terror and disgust as I saw Qabihoy's arm being torn off and devoured. Then, I felt the empty air behind me. I had backed into a cliff's edge. The last thing I remembered before falling was their faces, those white, soulless eyes and jagged teeth. I had no idea how long I had been unconscious until I woke up to a frog jumping onto my face. The light of dawn filtered through the tall blades of grass. My eyes were still heavy with sleep as I lazily reached up to push the frog off my mouth. When I finally sat up, I realized I was at a small stream, about 3 meters wide, with long stretches of pebbles on either side. I didn't know how I had gotten there or where there even was, but when I looked down, I finally saw just how bad my broken leg really was. My ankle was swollen and covered in a deep purple bruise. A sharp wave of pain shot through me, even though I had barely moved. My body was covered in dried blood and dirt. The adrenaline had long faded, and now the pain had multiplied tenfold. I forced myself to drag my body along the stream, crawling forward inch by inch until the sun was nearly setting. Every so often, I had to stop and rest. The sharp rocks and pebbles scraped against my skin, cutting me open in countless places. During one of those breaks, I scooped up a handful of pebbles and tucked them into my shirt, hoping to use them somehow later. That's when I noticed a small chunk of gold, about the size of my thumb. In my current state, I wished I had found something to eat instead. Many times, I wanted to stop for longer, to regain my strength, but I knew that if I didn't keep going, I would die out here. More than anything, I feared the dark, especially after everything I had just been through. As the day faded, an overwhelming instinct told me to move faster. It felt as if, the moment the sun disappeared, I would die. And then, finally, I saw a figure in the distance. Relief should have flooded me, but I didn't immediately call out for help. What if it was one of my villagers? If so, meeting them would be no different from death. And after all the misfortunes I had faced, meeting a fellow white man in this place felt like a sign from above. His name was Anderson, and he had come to this land in search of gold. After he helped bandage my wounds and splinted my leg with 2 wooden sticks, I begged him to take me to the embassy so I could return home. He hesitated, glancing at his scattered mining equipment. That's when I remembered the gold in my pocket. I pulled it out and handed it to him. He took a bite to test it, and once he confirmed it was real, he grinned with satisfaction and agreed to take me where I needed to go. The rest of my story is simple. I received medical care. The embassy helped me, and I eventually returned home. But when the people at the embassy asked what had really happened in that village, I refused to tell them. For one, my story sounded too unbelievable who would ever believe me. And more importantly, I didn't want to remember. I gave them a brief, fabricated account that I had fallen off a cliff and was lucky to be rescued by a nearby gold prospector. And I did ask them one thing. I asked about the phrase those creatures had spoken in unison. When translated, it meant, "Stay with us. This is the final stop." They laughed, joking that the villagers must have simply wanted me to stay. And I knew the true meaning. Those creatures had once been villagers themselves, cast down into that well just like I had been. If I had stayed, I would have become one of them. I would have transformed into something unrecognizable, a part of whatever horror lurked within that place. I was lucky. I had escaped. I had not given up. And, most importantly, I did not understand their language. After I returned home, I resumed my job as a high school teacher. I married a fellow teacher, and life should have gone back to normal. But it didn't. I became obsessed with light. At night, I turned on every light in the house before I could sleep. It seemed ridiculous. My wife and I had separate bedrooms. I never slept in the same room as her. She had known my story since we were dating, so she was understanding. Besides, who could comfortably sleep beside someone who needed every single light turned on at night? Years later, I still occasionally searched for information about that village, but there were no records, no documents, no mentions of their rituals or customs. Nothing. And even now, I wonder, what exactly was that well? What did it look like? Where was it located? My reason for telling you this story today is because of my son, Jack. He too has an inexplicable fear of the dark. One night, as my wife was putting him to bed, she accidentally turned off his nightlight after he had fallen asleep. In the middle of the night, we were both jolted awake by his terrified screams. When we rushed into his room, he was thrashing wildly, crying out in sheer panic. His voice trembled as he shouted. They have pale, empty eyes, jagged teeth. Don't let them get close. Turn on the lights. But here's the strangest part. I had never told him my story. Only my wife knew, and that had been long ago. She and I locked eyes, our expressions filled with shock and fear. Could my memories, my nightmares, have somehow been passed down to my son? Is that how we evolve? By inheriting the fears of our ancestors' warnings of dangers they once faced? I am still documenting everything, trying to understand. And do you have a fear that you cannot explain?